هيا بنا نلقاه في يومنا يا سادتي يا كرام سيروا لنيل المنى للخير هيا بنا نلقاه في يومنا يا سادتي يا كرام سيروا لنيل المنى سيروا لنيل المنى.
We start with the name of Allah. We praise and thank Allah for the givings He gave, without Allah being obligated to give anything. And we ask Allah to raise the rank of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his wives, believing relatives, companions, and those who follow them sincerely till Judgment Day. And we ask Allah to protect the nation of Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam from what the Prophet feared for his nation. Previously, we talked about istinja, cleaning oneself after urination and defecation. And we talked about its permissibility to be done, that it's an obligation for one, for the validity of the prayer, but it's permissible to be completed with wiping or by water. If one wipes, then they wipe the area at least 3 times or as many times as needed to remove the filth. And they need to use something that is a dry, solid, pure, uprooting, and not religiously respectable. And if they use water, then they would rinse the area until all of the filth was removed. And that the best way to make istinja is to wipe first and then use water. This would protect one from coming into physical contact, a lot of physical contact with the filth itself. That is, he would wipe the bulk of the filth away with a stone or what carries its judgment. And then he would rinse away the traces with water. So that's the best way to make al-istinja. Afterwards, the Sheikh, may Allah the Exalted have mercy on him, Sheikh Abdullah, he started to talk about the conditions, that among the conditions for the validity of the prayer also is for one to purify himself from a state of major ritual impurity. And one does that by making a ghusl or by making tayammum for the one who was unable to make ghusl for one of the excuses that makes it permissible for one to make dry purification, tayammum, instead. And as we mentioned, that a condition is not a part of the deed, that the deed is not valid without. So being clear of a state of major ritual impurity by making a ghusl is a condition for the validity of the prayer. If a person was in a state of major ritual impurity, then their prayer would not be valid. The rinsing of the body, the full body rinse that one performs to clear oneself of the major ritual impurity is called ghusl in Arabic, al-ghusl. There are 5 things that make performing a ghusl obligatory. Only 5 matters that would make ghusl obligatory for one to perform the prayer. That is, for the validity of one's prayer. Before performing the prayer, they would have to make this ghusl. There are other ghusls that a person may perform that are optional, like to perform a ghusl on Friday or after washing a dead body, for example. But as for the obligatory ghusl, there are only these 5 issues that make it obligatory on that individual themselves to make a full body rinse, a ghusl, so that they could pray. The first of them is for one to ejaculate, for the emission of one's mani. When we say the emission of one's mani, we don't simply mean the feeling of climax or the feeling of orgasm. Rather, it is for that mani fluid, the spermatic fluid or the ejaculated fluid, to exit and to exit from the body. So this fluid would have to reach the apparent part of the glans head of the male penis for him to be considered in a state of major ritual impurity from the emission of it, and be obligated to perform a ghusl before praying. So if a man, for example, felt the feeling of ejaculation, he felt the feeling, but the fluid didn't actually exit from his body to the apparent part of the glans penis, the glans head of the penis, then he would not be obligated to make a ghusl due to the emission of mani because he didn't emit it fully. Likewise, when it comes to a virgin female, the mani would have to reach the apparent part of her vagina. The apparent part of her vagina. So if she felt the feeling, but the mani did not reach the apparent part of her vagina, then for her making a ghusl would not be obligatory. Rather, she could make wudu. She would not be considered in a state of major ritual impurity. As for the non-virgin woman, the deflowered woman, if you would, the mani would need to reach the part of her genitalia, the part of her vagina that becomes apparent when squatting but is hidden when standing. So this differs somewhat from the case of the virgin female. So if she felt the feeling, but the mani did not become apparent to that place, to the part of her vagina that becomes apparent when squatting, but is hidden when standing, then she would not have gone into a state of major ritual impurity, and so she would not be considered, it would not be obligatory upon her to make ghusl due to ejaculation in this case. As for the mani itself, it has certain qualities, it has certain characteristics that one should know about, because there are other emissions that may come out of a person's private part, and if they don't know the difference between the mani and those emissions, then they may consider themselves in a state of major ritual impurity when truly they are not. And so they may put it upon themselves to go make a ghusl when really that's not obligatory upon them to do. And some people, they may have these other types of emissions that are not mani, they are not ejaculation, thus they do not necessitate a ghusl. Some people may have these types of emissions multiple times a day, throughout the day. And so it could become a hardship on a person if they thought that they have to go make a ghusl each time because of these emissions, when in reality it is not mani, so a ghusl would not be obligatory upon them. So the author, may Allah the Exalted have mercy on him, he clarified for us that mani has 3 signs. So if one of these signs is apparent and it is present with the mani, then he would consider that he ejaculated, and then he would be obligated to make a ghusl before he can pray. One sign is that it squirts out. All right, so when a person ejaculates, when they emit their mani, then it comes out squirting, some after another, some after another, some after another, until they're finished. So some of those other emissions, they do not come out like this. It may just, for example, drip or something like this. There's something called madhi that may come out if a person exerted himself physically, for example, but it's not mani, so it doesn't squirt and it doesn't have the characteristics of mani that we're going to mention for you. So then if a person had that happen to them, if they emitted madhi, it might also be like a thick substance that has a color like it's not completely clear. It may have a milky color, for example. Then they would not have to make the ghusl. Uh, Another sign of the mani is that it is uh, it is accompanied with a feeling of pleasure. All right, it is accompanied with a feeling of pleasure, and this feeling of pleasure, it wanes after one has finished ejaculating. It wanes. Their feeling of desire, it wanes. It fades after the ejaculation. So this is another sign of mani. This is another sign of mani. So if a person emitted something and it was accompanied by a feeling of pleasure, and then that feeling, that desire waned afterwards, then this would be a sign that what he emitted was mani. The third sign of mani is that it would have the smell of dough when moist. Dough, like when you take a grain like wheat and you turn it into flour, and then you mix it with water and you knead it, and it becomes like that. When you prepare, it becomes like a mass of soft material when you are preparing for bread, for example, or crust or other edibles. Then this has a specific smell to it. Dough has a specific smell to it. So mani, it has a smell that resembles dough when it is wet. And when it dries, it has a smell that resembles egg whites. So egg whites, if you crack an egg, you crack an egg, it has the yellow of the egg and has the white part of the egg, the part that is clear before you cook it, and then it becomes white when you cook it. This mani, it has the smell of egg whites when dry. When mani dries up, it has a smell that resembles the smell of egg whites. And these signs, these characteristics of mani, they exist in male mani and female mani. So it's not just one or the other. The Sheikh said, thus the one who saw mani on his clothing or on his bedding, that he knows that no one other than himself or herself slept in, then it would be obligatory for them to make a ghusl. He said that likewise it would be obligatory upon that person to repeat every obligatory prayer that he prayed, that it's possible that he prayed while he was in a state of major ritual impurity if he had missed that. And if a person ejaculated and then they weren't aware of that at first, and they didn't perceive that at first, and then after a while they had prayed some prayers, they thought that they weren't in a state of major ritual impurity, so they made wudu, for example, and then they went and prayed some prayers, and then they found mani in their bedding that no one else sleeps in. For sure, no one else sleeps in it. Then the person would make up those prayers that it's possible they prayed in between the ejaculation and the and when they finally discovered and found out that it had actually happened before. So we said that there are 5 matters that necessitate a ghusl. The first one is the emission of mani. The second is sexual intercourse. Sexual intercourse has a minimum, and that is for the man to enter the whole glans, head of the penis, the complete head of the penis into the private part, whether it was vaginal intercourse or anal intercourse. Anal intercourse also makes a person need to make a ghusl before they pray. Although that is something that is prohibited, anal intercourse, even with one's wife or female slave, is prohibited in the religion. It's not permissible, it's not halal. However, if a person did that, then of course they would be sinful. They would be obligated to repent, but they would also be in a state of major ritual impurity. So they would need to know that they have to make a ghusl before they could pray. Because if they didn't, then they might go for a period of time without making a ghusl and performing the prayer without it actually being valid, because they had not fulfilled all of the conditions for the validity of the prayer. Among them is being clear of the state of major ritual impurity. If a man, the head of his penis was cut off, then the amount that is similar, is equal to the head of the penis of what's left, would be the amount that he would have to insert for him to be considered in a state of major ritual impurity. So if that part of his genitalia was severed, it was gone, then an amount equal to that part of what remains is what he would have to insert for him to be considered in a state of major ritual impurity. As for the third matter that necessitates the purificatory bath, the ghusl, the full body rinse, it is menstrual blood, that is the termination of menses. The menstrual blood is the blood that exits from the womb of a woman, and it is not an indication of sickness. Rather, this blood exits when she's healthy. Even when she's healthy, it's not an indicator of sickness. And likewise, this is not blood that exits from her due to childbirth, due to the termination of childbirth after she gives birth, because that is called postpartum bleeding, nifas. That's its own individual issue. The minimum age that a woman would start to bleed menstrual blood is approximately 9 lunar years of age. So be mindful. Remember that when we mention ages and the passage of time in the religious text, or in the talk about religious judgments, then we're talking about the lunar calendar, the lunar months, and the lunar year. So the youngest that a female the youngest age that she would menstruate menstrual blood is approximately 9 lunar years. To be exact, it would be what is less than 16 days before her 9th birthday. What is less than 16 days before her 9th birthday. So if she began to bleed a week before her 9th lunar birthday, then this would be considered menstrual blood. Or even 2 weeks before her 9th lunar birthday, this would be considered menstrual blood. Or even 2 weeks and 1 day, or even 2 weeks, 1 day, 23 hours, and 59 minutes, for example, be 59, 2 hours, let's see, 2 weeks, 1 day, 23 hours, and 59 minutes, and 59 seconds, for example, before her 9th birthday. That would, if she starts to bleed at that point, that's less than 16 days before her lunar birthday. So this would be considered menstrual bleeding. However, if it was before that, if it was more than, if it was 16 days or more before her 9th lunar birthday, like for example, she was 8.5, or 8 years old, or 7, or 7.5, or 6, and she started to bleed from her genitalia, from her vagina, then this would not be considered menstrual blood. It would be considered the blood of sickness. The minimum of menstrual blood would be 24 hours. So if a woman bled for a period of time and then stopped and it didn't reach 24 hours, it's not considered menstrual bleeding. And this bleeding doesn't all have to be concurrent. It doesn't have to be uninterrupted, nonstop. Rather, if a woman bled for 6 hours and then stopped, and then the next day she bled for 6 hours and then stopped, and then the next day she bled for 6 hours and then stopped, and then the next day she bled for 6 hours, then stopped, that's altogether 24 hours. So then that would be considered menses. The maximum time for duration for menstrual bleeding, the maximum duration for menstrual bleeding is 15 days. So if a woman bled for what goes past the 15-day marker, then some of that blood would not be considered menstrual blood. Some of it would not be considered menstrual blood. And there's a whole section of knowledge that is very beneficial with many very useful details that gives a person a good understanding of what the woman does in these different circumstances and how she counts the days and exactly what she would consider menstrual blood and what she would consider sickness bleeding. And it's very nice, mashallah. So I encourage you to acquire those additional details that we do not go into here. The norm for women, the normal time duration for menstrual bleeding is 6 or 7 days. That is, usually the menstrual bleeding would be for 6 or 7 days, but it could go beyond that. It could go beyond that, but it would not go past 15 days. So here we've talked about 3 matters that cause a person to have to make a purificatory bath, a ghusl, a full body rinse, before they can pray. The first that we mentioned is the emission of mani. The second was sexual intercourse. And the third was the termination of a woman's menses. When her menstrual bleeding ends, then she's obligated to make a ghusl before she can pray. The fourth is the postpartum bleeding. And this is the blood that exits after the child has completely separated from the womb, after childbirth. And so not the bleeding that may occur, the blood that may exit during childbirth while the baby's still coming out, but after the baby is separated, the bleeding that happens after that, this is the postpartum bleeding. Its minimum is 1 moment of bleeding. It could last for just a moment. However, it could go on much longer than that, up to 60 days. That's the maximum. A woman could bleed the postpartum bleeding up to 60 days, but the norm is 40 days of bleeding. It could be less than that. It could be more than that, but it would not go beyond 60 days. Once the postpartum bleeding ended, then this is when the woman is obligated to make a purificatory bath before she prays. And the fifth and final matter from what the author mentioned here that necessitates a purificatory bath is childbirth itself. So had a woman hypothetically, and if we said, and hypothetically speaking, that a woman gave birth without any bleeding, that no blood came out, then, and afterwards, then still she would have to make a ghusl just due to the childbirth itself. The author, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him, he said that this ghusl would be obligatory even if what the woman gave birth to was an alaqah, meaning the blood clot that was the development of the mixed ejaculated fluid of the two parents. And the child, their origin is from the ejaculated fluid, the mani, of their parents. And then if Allah willed, that would develop into something that is like a hardened blood. That is what is called an alaqah. So if a woman didn't give birth to a fully formed child, but she gave birth, she pushed out an alaqah that was from that fluid, yani it was the somewhat developed form whose origin was from that ejaculated fluid of the two parents, then still she would have to make a ghusl before she prayed. Or if what came out of her was a mudghah, which is a further state of development of that the origin of the ejaculated fluid, that whose origin was from the mixed ejaculated fluid of the two parents. And this is when that becomes like a hunk of flesh. First, it would start out as the mixed fluid. Then, if Allah willed, it would develop into like hardened blood. And then, if Allah willed, it would develop into like a chunk of flesh, a piece of flesh. So if she gave birth to it during that state of development, then likewise she would have to make a ghusl before she could pray. And that is if the midwives, the women who have experience and knowledge of these affairs and knowledge of when a woman gives a premature birth like this, that what actually came out is from human origin, then if these women said that it is of human origin, then the woman would have to make a ghusl. She would have to make a ghusl before she would be permitted to pray. The scholars mention this, that a woman giving birth, she has to make a ghusl even if she did not have any postpartum bleeding, because the child himself is, in reality, his origin is from the mani of the woman and the man. So just as we say that the person, if they emit their mani, they are obligated to make a purificatory bath, make a ghusl before they are permitted to pray. Likewise, if a woman gives birth, then what she's giving birth to, its origin is from that mani, the mani of herself and the man. If a woman had intercourse with a man and then she knows about herself that she did not ejaculate, and then but he did ejaculate, and then after the intercourse she made the ghusl, and then after making the ghusl his mani exited out of her, then she would not be obligated to reperform her ghusl, because she did not emit her own mani. Rather, that was the mani of the man. So she would not be obligated to make a ghusl, to reperform her ghusl, for her to be able to pray. In some of the books of the scholars, it was mentioned that death was a reason for a ghusl, but of course, when the person dies, they themselves have left the abode of accountability. They have left the state of accountability, so the dead person is not obligated themselves to make a ghusl. Rather, that would be a communal obligation upon the Muslims to wash the dead body along with shrouding him and praying for him and burying him. With that, we have mentioned the matters pertaining to the the matters that necessitate the obligatory ghusl. We have mentioned about the matters that necessitate the obligatory ghusl. And so we know what causes the person to have to make a ghusl. No other matter makes the person have to make a ghusl for the obligatory prayer. Rather, these 5 matters are it. Inshallah, in the next session, we'll talk about the ghusl itself, how it is performed, its integrals, and we'll mention some matters pertaining to tayammum, insha'Allah ta'ala. Walhamdulillah, wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. La ilaha illallah, Allahumma salli ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim.
قلوبنا هامت بذكر الله 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 قلوبنا هامت بذكر الله 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 قلوبنا هامت بذكر الله الله الله
أتيناك بالفقر يا ذا الغنى وأنت الذي لم تزل محسنا فرحا ويسر لنا سبيل الرشاد وجود بالهنا الله يا الله يا الله يا الله الله يا الله يا أزل كربنا فالعنا قد دنا أزل كربنا فالعنا قد دنا أنلنا المنى أغننا واحمنا الله هون أسانا ولا تخزنا فقد بات فينا الأسى محزنا فؤادي اغتنى